Now, as more and more time goes on, even though as of right now, I currently own a portfolio with over 50 different holdings in it, I still am interested in exposing myself to more different stocks and ETFs to continue diversifying as my portfolio grows larger and larger in the future. And this is just because for me specifically as an investor, I have a pretty low risk tolerance and I don't want my portfolio to be exposed to massive volatility consistently. Now, along with that inside my portfolio as of right now, I don't really have all that much exposure to anything international or global, which brings me into the point of today's video. In this video, we're going to go through an ETF that offers a massive amount of diversification. We're talking almost 10,000 individual stocks all inside of one ETF. This ETF not only is going to offer you some of the biggest exposure of any investment across the market, but also is going to offer some international and global exposure, which like I said, for me personally, I don't currently really have. So if you want to dig into this ultra diversified ETF with me that offers exposure to so many different stocks, you're not even going to believe it, along with tons of international and global names. Well, then make sure to stick around, drop a like down below, and let's get right into it. If you are a dividend investor who wants to level up your portfolio, you need to be tracking your dividend income consistently. And that's why I created the perfect dividend tracker that I've used to scale my dividend income up to all-time highs over the last year. Now, along with this dividend tracker, you're also going to receive my A to Z dividend investing ebook, which shows you how I personally started from $0 several years ago to now where I earn over $7,500 per month in dividends. So if you want this tracker and the ebook, go to the first link down below in my description and grab it today. So the ETF for this video, like some of you guys probably already guessed it, it's ticker symbol VT or the Vanguard Total World Stock ETF. Now, this ETF is brought to us by Vanguard, so it's obviously high quality and very cheap to hold on to with an expense ratio of 0.07%. Now, during the intro, I was talking about the fact that this ETF offers a massive amount of diversification, and that's because it's literally the Total World Stock ETF. There's almost 10,000 individual names inside this ETF, which honestly is probably over diversified. But for some of those investors like myself that want a little bit of exposure into a lot of different assets, this ETF is almost perfect. Now, the asset class is international and global stocks. So again, for those investors out there that might not have any international or global exposure like myself, but maybe want some, this ETF is going to give you exactly that. Now, I also mentioned during the intro that I'm interested in even more diversification as time goes on, and that's just because I want to be able to sleep very well at night knowing that my portfolio is going to continue to perform well, even if say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stocks have a bad quarter or year. Now, with an ETF like this one, you don't have to rely on a single stock having a good year or bad quarter. I mean, heck, even 10 or 20 of them or 100 of them could probably do bad and you wouldn't really notice. Now, this ETF has been trading since 2008, so there is a good amount of historical data to go off of. But the product summary is invest in both foreign and US stocks, seeks to track the performance of the FTSE Global All Cap Index, which covers both well-established and still developing markets. Now, why is this important? Well, some of the developing markets might offer a lot more upside than some of the more well-established ones, and especially if you're like myself and don't really have all that much exposure into still developing markets, well, why not gain some exposure into a ultra diversified ETF like this one? Now, also important, it says has high potential for growth, but also high risk. Shares may swing up and down more than US or international stock funds, only appropriate for long-term goals, long-term investors. But as far as the fund's performance since inception, around 7.63%, but just as of recently the last year, it's up around 16.44%. Now, with an ETF like this one, because there is a large exposure into still developing markets, it's sort of unknown whether or not this ETF is going to say outperform the S&P anytime soon. But again, just for those investors that want some exposure, I'm not saying that I personally would buy this ETF with my entire portfolio, but just to have a little bit of exposure that's low cost into some still developing areas, this ETF offers it. Now, also important, especially for an ETF like this one, you're going to want to look at the weighted exposure. So this ETF is going to offer around 9.5% in emerging markets, 13.5% in Europe, 9.2% in Pacific, 0.2% in Middle East, around 67.6% in North America. So although you're getting a ton of exposure in North America, which is what I pretty much have in my portfolio as of right now, you're still getting a good amount of exposure into things like Europe, Pacific, or emerging markets. Now, again, a lot of investors sort of argue that, well, I don't really need exposure in anything but North America because, to be honest, a lot of companies in the USA alone have done very, very well. But again, for those investors that do want some emerging market exposure, especially if you've sort of already built out a long-term portfolio that's going to be lacking it, it could potentially be a good idea. Now, interestingly enough, if you look at the top tickers for this ETF as of right now, names like Apple, Nvidia, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, Tesla, Google, Broadcom, and Google make up the majority of the ETF. But again, there's over 9,700 different stocks inside this ETF. So even though you're getting exposure, a lot of exposure to names like these, that could potentially do very, very well in the future. Now, looking a little bit deeper into this ETF's performance as far as price return and even dividends go, on the 1 year time frame, the ETF is up almost 17%. So just as of recently in the last year, it's actually done very, very well, outperforming a lot of different time periods, which is awesome to see. Now, since inception, when this ETF was trading just under $50 per share, it has over doubled. So it's not like this ETF has necessarily traded bad. But again, if you compare it to something like like the S&P 500 or a lot of other North American only ETFs, it has underperformed. Now that being said, this ETF offers a ton of low-cost diversification, where again is where I really see it shines. Now as far as dividends go, VT does pay a dividend, around 2% trailing 12-month dividend yield. So not bad whatsoever, actually even more of a yield than a lot of the other popular ETFs out there. And especially with the fact that you get so much exposure, you're getting almost 2% starting off. Not to mention, as far as dividend growth goes, on the trailing 12 month, we have around 7%, the last 3 years around 5.5%, and then the last 5 and 10 years around 4.5%. So not the fastest growing dividend, but of course this ETF is more or less growth focused. Now that being said, if you look at the dividend history, the dividends have been moving up and to the right, and the quarterly dividend payouts are not bad whatsoever, especially for an investor that mostly is buying into VT for the growth potential. Now I thought it would also be interesting to compare VT to SPY, and this is over the past 16.53 years. So ever since 2008, if an investor spent $10,000, let's say, and then reinvested those dividends over the last 16, almost 17 years, if they would have bought into VT, a $10,000 investment would have turned to $34,000, $35,000, or around, like we saw, almost 8% average annual total return, around 250% total return altogether. Now during the same time frame, SPY has outperformed VT by quite a margin, around 535% total return, with almost 12% on average per year. That $10,000 would have turned into $63,000+. So the big question that I personally have when it comes to Vanguard Total World Stock ETF is, if I were to buy this one, why would I not just buy into the S&P 500, which already offers a ton of diversification in 500 different individual companies, and that has outperformed almost every single stock and ETF across the market over the past several years? Well, my answer to that would simply be because VT does offer total world exposure and offers you so much diversification in so many different names, with also exposure in still developing markets, which could in fact in the future outperform a lot of different ETFs and or stocks, but only time will tell. Now, like I said earlier, I personally would never make VT a massive portion of my personal portfolio, and that's just because I would rather have more exposure to the NASDAQ and the S&P than the total world index. But for those investors like myself that don't necessarily have any international and or global stock exposure as of right now, which speaking for myself, I really don't, VT is an awesome ETF to give you that exposure, massive amount of exposure, for just 0.07%. Now, especially for newer investors in the stock market, especially for investors that don't necessarily know what they're doing and just want to have some exposure to a ton of different stocks, some of these ultra diversified ETFs like VT or even like VTI always come to mind whenever I talk to family or friends. When they ask me what should I get into, I want to start investing in the stock market, but I just don't know what to buy. And by buying these, you're getting exposure to so many different names, which is a single click of the button for 0.07%. So that's just another massive use case when it comes to ETFs like this. So now that we talked about VT, the Vanguard Total World Stock ETF, I shared with you guys the performance, what this ETF has to offer, the holdings, and even how it stacks up next to the S&P. I'll ask you want to hear from you guys down below. Whether it's VT or not, which ETFs and or stocks are you currently buying for international and or global exposure? Let me know down below in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to please drop a like on it and subscribe for more future content like this. Thanks as always for stopping by, and if you are interested in investing, make sure to check out these recent videos I posted right here.